Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
Welcome to A Slice of SEL. We're the SEL services team at the St. Croix River Education District. I'm Nick.
I'm Rye.
And I'm Courtney.
This week, we're going to walk you through some verbal de-escalation strategies that will help you to reestablish instructional control to get things back on track if you're working with a student and things have gone off the rails. And that description I just gave, I carefully worded that. So I quote, "When things have gone off the rails and we need to get back on track." Because we do want you to know right up front that these strategies aren't just going to be useful when a student is obviously in fight or flight mode. And maybe it's just my own bias, but when I hear verbal de-escalation, I'm expecting that some of our listeners might hear that and picture a student who's hyperventilating, pulling at their hair, they just look frantic, and it's really obvious they're in that fight or flight mode. Certainly these strategies would be helpful in that situation, but I've used them just as often and with just as much success with students who may be a little bit agitated, but they still appear to have a lot of rationality. For example, like a student who's slowly walking around a hallway, trying to rip posters down off the walls, kind of looking around, seeing where they have an opening to get in there and rip one down. And it's dangerous to think that you can read a student's mind, and I can't say for sure at any given moment how agitated a student is, how much cortisol is running through their system. But the idea we're trying to get across right up front here is that regardless of how close to fight or flight mode that student is, if we've lost instructional control, these strategies are going to be relevant and useful.
But before we get into that, let's talk about what's filling our buckets this week. Yesterday, I was in the Caribou line, and the person in front of me paid for my drink. And, usually I would be, paying it forward. But I was just, so shocked because it just caught me so off guard. So I just, graciously accepted it and drove off. But then today, after I had time to think about it, I went back to Caribou and I paid for the person behind me today. So I did end up paying it forward. So that did definitely fill my bucket.
I was laughing, right? Because I think this is maybe the third time on the podcast when that's been your bucket filler.
Between coffee and weather.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's a northern Minnesota thing. It just seems to happen to you pretty
all the time.
Often.
Perhaps.
What's filling my bucket is a friend from grad school who lives in another state. She texted me that one of my favorite songs, she just heard it on the radio, and she said she thought of me because it's one that I had recorded on my acoustic guitar and put on YouTube, and she liked that recording of it, which was really sweet. And yeah, now whenever she hears it, she thinks of no, Nick. So it was cute. And it's a song that was by Minneapolis band The Replacements, so very Minneapolis.
Oh my gosh,
so
cool.
Cute. Love it. What's filling my bucket today is just getting to record the podcast. I don't know if all of our listeners know, but at the very beginning, it was not something that, I don't know, Ryan and I for sure were not super confident about, but it's gotten to be one of the most fun parts of my week. So I'm thrilled to be here. And then I actually get to physically see Rye tonight. I bought flowers from her daughters, and she's delivering them to me, so I'm super excited.
Oh,
okay,
so
I guess that's a bucket filler for me too, Court.
It's fine.
So we're going to shift to our main topic, verbal de-escalation strategies. Now, if you're a repeat listener to the podcast, you do know that at this point we often give some prefaces. I think that's the plural. Some of the why and the when before we jump into that how. FYI, we always put time codes in the episode description so that you can just jump into that how section if that's all that you're looking for here. But right now, we're going to say a few words about when people might be using these strategies and what kind of situations you would want to use verbal de-escalation strategies. And that's going to lead us into talking a little bit about our experiences with verbal de-escalation strategies, which is hopefully going to convince you that we do know a bit about what we're talking about today. Next, we're going to chat about nonverbals and your relationship with the student. Things that are so crucial to using these strategies effectively. Can't overemphasize that enough. And then finally, we are going to walk you through those verbal de-escalation strategies themselves.
All right, thanks for that preview, Nick. So let's talk about the when for a moment. But we're not going to belabor it because I think if you found this episode, you probably have some situations already in mind where you'd like to use these strategies. It's a popular topic, and Ryan and I are always asked to train special education teachers and paraprofessionals on it in August. And we also sometimes get requests to do trainings for teams on it during the school year. Nick, I know you provided some trainings to the Tier 1, so like all staff in elementary schools this spring who felt a need to become more comfortable and fluent in those de-escalation strategies.
Yeah, with students coming back into the building this spring as we got more vaccinated and just all the adjustment issues that you would expect students to have after being out of the building for so long, there was a lot of, need for verbal de-escalation, so got some requests for that. But yeah, those trainings were framed around a verbal de-escalation lanyard badge that schools were giving to all their staff, and I know that's a popular ticket item in many of our schools, and we are going to link a few versions of that lanyard badge into the show notes if you're interested. The one that we're talking about always has these verbal de-escalation strategies on one side of it. And on the flip side, sometimes we have the empathetic listening skills that we talked about in a previous podcast episode. The ones that I made a lot this spring featured the mood meter from Yale. We've mentioned that many times on the podcast. But we put that there on the flip side of these verbal de-escalation strategies so that teachers could help students name their feeling. But I did talk about the when while I was training those staff, and we said one situation that this is going to come in handy is what you might call a corrective chat or a hallway referral. Also a previous podcast episode. We've covered a lot of topics on the podcast this year. But in a corrective chat or in a hallway referral, if a student is breaking a classroom rule and we're past that point of redirection, we might pull the student into the hallway. Not literally pull them, but like they walk out of the hallway with us, or kneel next to their desk, and we'd have a chat about getting back on track. Now, if during that chat, in that situation, you lose instructional control, so maybe the student shouts at you and storms away, maybe they flip a bunch of books off their desk, etc., etc. So you're trying to, have that chat, get things back on track, and then you lose instructional control. If that happens, that's when we would want to pause our chat and use some of these verbal de-escalation strategies to hopefully wrangle it back in and move on.
Right, but that's not the only situation too. A few other examples might be maybe the student has been referred to the stop and think room, but they're not going to go there. I, as the teacher, or maybe a paraprofessional, would want to use these de-escalation strategies to work with the student and regain that instructional control. If a student is in that stop and think room and they're maybe trying to push a peer, maybe they're ripping papers, playing with them. Another example of a situation where we'd want to use these strategies to establish instructional control.
Right. Thanks, Rye. I think what you just said kind of leads into our experiences using the verbal de-escalation strategies. Because I mentioned on the podcast before this year, I worked for the last 3 years at a K-12 setting for behavior-focused special ed program, and we use these strategies constantly. So we had the corrective chats or hallway referrals that I mentioned a moment ago. We had those all the time. And yeah, if we lost instructional control during one of those chats, we definitely used these strategies. I would use these strategies in our stop and think room as well. And we also needed to use them when a student was out of place, sometimes refusing to leave a classroom, sometimes wandering around the hallway. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that on the kinds of behaviors that were happening in those situations, because I try and preserve students' dignity. But if you do know setting 4 programs, you know that there's very intense verbal and physical aggression, property destruction, etc. It's not uncommon to have those things in students' repertoires. So what I would say is that the strategies we're talking about today do work even for students with very significant needs if you're using these strategies correctly. So take it from me, please.
Right. And my experience using the verbal de-escalation was more of like a trial and error type thing. My previous job and trainings, we didn't have explicit instruction on what it did look like to use these, to use the strategies we're going to get into. We were a CPI trained district though, so we did have a little bit of a basis. If our listeners are familiar with that, they talk a little bit about verbal escalation and what that looks like and some ways to intervene. But it was more of a let's see if this works type thing. And I just kind of found a groove that worked for me when students would be argumentative, or I would have referrals or have kids have to come down to my room because they couldn't stay in the classroom they were in. Those were the types of situations where that really came in handy.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Courtney said. We came from the same district, but different buildings. It was just, like she said, let's see if it works, and just really trying to find that groove and what works with those students that you're working with.
Yeah, I know, guys, I had a similar kind of experience at the first job I ever had in education. I was a paraprofessional at a residential school, and we were CPI trained, but we didn't get the kind of phrases to help with verbal de-escalation in that training itself. And I just know once I got to a point where someone actually taught me and gave me some examples like we're going to do today, it was so helpful. And I wish I could have go back in a time machine and teach that to old Nick from college. So I'm really excited for our listeners to get this content today. All right, and the last preface before we get into the strategies themselves is just about nonverbals and your relationship with the student. These are incredibly important things to consider because they will definitely make or break your success with these strategies themselves. So if we start to use these strategies and your perception is that you're not being successful, a few things might be happening. I mean, you might be using the right words, but just too much of them. So you might be babbling on, and I've been in that situation, like we make mistakes. You might be babbling on, like stringing too many of these verbal de-escalation phrases together. And one thing, guys, we know about agitated people, not just kids, agitated people, is that noise, even things that normally don't bother us, noise can very easily turn that stress dial up.
Right. If you're in an argument with someone, you know that too much talking can very quickly turn your mood from angry to just furious. But the other things that might be happening is that your tone of voice or your body language might be completely torpedoing any chance of success you have. If I'm saying the right words, but I'm obviously being sarcastic, or maybe I'm overly sweet and condescending, right there I have no chance. All the student's going to respond to is the voice tone, and I might as well just not be talking because I'm going to be making that situation worse. And I know I do sometimes do that condescending thing in my own life, so I'm constantly being reminded not to sound too sweet or like anything like that. But instead, with my voice, I really just want to be warm but firm also. I'm there to set limits and maintain boundaries, so I'm not going to be just cooing at this kid, but that doesn't mean my voice can't convey, hey, I still care about you. That balance is important, and I think educators generally know that it's what we're striving for.
Yeah, you hear that phrase warm demanding with instruction in general and kind of your stance and your voice tone and your body language. And I think we're going to talk a lot about balance today because it really is a balancing act between showing that we care about the kids, but also being firm and setting those boundaries so there's that structure there. And last, like your relationship. Let's talk about that for a second. So I'll just say I'm pretty good at these techniques that we're talking about today. At least I was at this time last year. Now I'm probably getting pretty rusty because of my change in role. But anyway, if I just rolled into a crisis situation in a random school tomorrow and tried to use these de-escalation strategies, there's a very good chance that I'd be less effective than someone who has no training in this stuff whatsoever, but they do have a fairly good relationship with the student. So you want to make your student, in general, just proactively, it benefits you in so many ways to make your students feel valued, known, and respected, and nothing can replace that. So if that's your base, you know that it makes everything in your life easier, including situations where the student is very agitated. So guys, with all of that context in mind, we're finally going to talk about the strategies themselves. And these particular strategies come from Boys Town. And the Boys Town organization does have some resources on their website and on their YouTube channel about these strategies. So people in our member districts, you know that you can talk to one of us if you want more support with these strategies. But FYI, if you're a listener from an external district, Boys Town has put some resources out there that you can take advantage of.
So now we're going to talk about the 5 strategies. So the first one is praise and empathy statements. Then we'll go into reality statements, coupling statements, choice statements, and then lastly, prompting a cool down or a calm down break.
Right. So when we say praise or empathy statement, that's generally a short 1-sentence comment that we're making to the student as we begin that interaction. So if I'm starting the corrective conversation or walking up to the student in the hallway who just flipped over the desk and ran out of their classroom, I'm trying to start the conversation on a good note and rapidly build some rapport. So on the praise side of things, I'm just looking for anything they're doing that does meet expectations. I might say, hey, thanks for looking at me, or hey, thanks for walking out here with me. The student always has options for what they're saying and doing, so there's always something that we can praise. If a student's been standing in the corner of the classroom grabbing things and throwing them at staff for a few minutes, if I walk in and ask if we can talk and they stop throwing things, I can say, hey, thanks for using safe hands so we can talk.
On the empathy side of things, I could say things like, hey, I know it's really tough to accept a correction. Or, hey, it looks like you're really frustrated and I'd really like to help. A short phrase like that sends the signal that you care about how they feel. And I just want to repeat something that Courtney said a moment ago. This really should only be a short one-sentence comment that you make. So I am either picking either a praise or an empathy statement to get that conversation off on a good note. And then I'm done with that and I'm moving on to the other strategies we're going to cover.
Right, and I think Rye's emphasizing that because, again, we don't want to stand there and coo at the student, repeatedly praising and empathizing while we're still outside of instructional control. If a student's trying to rip things off a wall, it's generally not the best idea to be trying to engage them in an empathetic conversation. It's generally a better idea to be using reality statements, coupling statements, or choice statements to guide that student to stop disruptive or dangerous behavior and maybe go to the stop and think room or go back to the classroom. Go wherever and do whatever is expected, and then we can have that empathetic conversation after.
Right, and we could spend the entire episode on just this, but it's important to at least try to address this mindset and this approach piece. We're not at all trying to give the impression that you should be cold and uncaring to students. A lot of our students are really struggling and they need adult support. They need connection, that they desperately need that listening ear, but we're not setting them up for success long term if our actions teach them that when they throw a fit, break our rules, etc., then I get a listening ear in that moment. Now, we should be trying our darndest to give that student that connection and that listening ear proactively and teaching them to ask for it when they need it. But if we do find ourselves in that out of control, disruptive situation, I need to maintain some boundaries. And one of those is typically, hey, we'll talk about this when, and then finish that sentence. And until that point, I'm going to help the student regulate and make good decisions. That's my priorities, kind of helping them to come back down, regulate, and make good decisions. And then we can have more dialogue. You've probably encountered that idea in parenting or teaching where we're either being authoritarian, authoritative, or permissive. What we're trying to do in general is stay in that Goldilocks zone of authoritative. But enough about that approach piece. Let's move on and cover reality statements. So what we're trying to do here with a reality statement is take a student's want or need and connect it to the expectation that we have for them. So a reality statement might sound like, hey, this doesn't have to get any bigger. Let's keep it small. Or, the quicker we work through this, the quicker we can get back to recess. Or, hey, talking about this quietly will keep it between the two of us. So when I said a moment ago, the students want or their need, this might be something that they just told me. Like maybe they screamed, I want to go back to recess. But it could also be something implied. Like I think the student cares about their privacy with the volume comment that I made about keeping things between the two of us. I really like the let's keep it small, it doesn't have to get any bigger phrase that I used. It's one of my personal go-to favorites because it works on the general idea that the student doesn't want to get in bigger trouble, but they do tend to spiral once they've made a small mistake. Like, oh, now everything is ruined. My day is shot. And that mental tornado starts going really fast, I found with a lot of students I've worked with. So that just that simple phrase like, hey, let's keep it small is just a good reminder that if you work with me and engage with me, the situation doesn't have to get any bigger.
Thanks, Nick. Next, we're going to talk about coupling statements. So these are really similar to redirection. When I was a teacher, if I saw a student off task, I might say to them, hey, Sarah, I need you to stay with us. So I'm just reminding the student of the expectation. The only difference with a coupling statement is that I'm also labeling what the student's currently doing. So it might sound more like, Rye, you're yelling. A better choice would be to lower your voice. Or it would be a good choice to use a talking voice. That's a good example because voice volume is one of those things that it's easy to lose track of when you're agitated, and the student might not be in tune with how loud their voice has gotten. And when students are agitated, we know they're not as rational. It is often helpful to give them a reminder of what I'm expecting rather than just assuming they know in the moment.
Right. And none of this is a silver bullet that's going to magically work the first time, in every situation. I know that's what we really want in education. But that said, yeah, if you compare your options, just think about your options. I could just say, stop shouting, or stop swearing, or quit shoving me. And hey, I could also raise my voice and present as pretty aggressive to the student in just my posture in general. And I'll be honest, because some of our listeners might be wondering, like, I've seen that stuff happen. I've definitely seen educators, raise their voice, use phrases like stop shouting. And I've seen that work. Work in that it stopped whatever behavior was happening at that given time from the student. But think about it. We are playing the long game here. So if I'm being loud and aggressive and only saying things like stop X or quit Y, it's like bringing out the big guns. And every time I do that, it's becoming less effective. And this is another point to make. Like, I've seen that kind of response entertain a student or have them just ignore it or laugh at it way more times than I've seen it be effective. So I got a bit off track there, but the point is that you're going to be supportive and more likely to be consistently effective if you do get in that habit of saying things like, Britta, right now you're doing X. A better choice would be to do Y, or something similar to that. And yeah, control your volume and your nonverbals. Can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, another way that this can work really poorly, Nick, is when we're sarcastic or condescending, like we mentioned earlier. So I've seen that happen more with coupling statements than probably any of the others we're talking about. So it's easy to slip into, right now you're swearing. A good choice would be to use appropriate language and be real condescending and nasty about it. Just don't. Again, at that point, you're shooting yourself in the foot and it's going to do more harm than good, both in the moment and to your relationship with that student. Another pitfall we should mention is using language that's not objective and clear. So for example, if we say, right now you're being disrespectful. Respect is a notoriously broad and vague concept. Students and teachers disagree all the time about whether or not any given action is respectful or not, and we don't want to open up that can of worms in a situation like this. So try to be more specific and objective when you're talking about what's expected. It's more effective to use language that points out the volume of their voice, whether words are expected or not, if their body is safe, etc.
Good points all around, Court. And the last thing I do want to mention about coupling statements before we move on is that these are frequently comboed with reality statements. And that sentence probably sounded pretty jargony. I just want to explain why. I would even suggest, like, hey, try and combo your coupling statements and reality statements. Because we do want to send that message. You don't want to sound robotic with this stuff. You don't want to sound like a little robot that's just parroting these phrases over and over again. Because students aren't going to respond well to that. You're probably going to sound pretty awkward with it the first couple times, 20 times, 50 times, like I probably did. But if you use these phrases, you're going to get more fluent. You will, and you're going to reach that point where it's just second nature and you're able to not completely drift from this good language we're talking about, because we don't want that. We don't want that complete drift. But you are able to make these phrases and these coupling and reality statements sound natural. And part of that is being able to weave the pieces together when it makes sense. So I might have a student, for example, trying to rip posters off the walls, and it's also apparent that that student wants to talk to me about something that's bothering them. And I might say, John, right now you're trying to rip those posters down. If you walk with me to the stop and think room, we can talk about what's bugging you, and that would be a better choice right now. So that was an example of me weaving together a reality statement and a coupling statement, and it hopefully sounded pretty natural.
Thanks, Nick and Court, but I am watching the clock, and I think we need to move on to choice statements. So choice statements are less frequently used than the reality and coupling statements that we've talked about, but they're still really important. Basically, I'm just offering the student a few options, all of which I have to be okay with them choosing. So when we're talking earlier about being authoritative, of hitting that balance when we're being supportive, but we're still maintaining boundaries. I'm not going to stand there cooing at the student and have an empathetic conversation while their behavior is disruptive or dangerous, but one thing I might do is offer them options. Like, if I'm willing to sit down in the hallway with them and talk, I might say, hey, George, I'd like to talk to you about this. Would you like to sit down with me and talk here, or would you like to go to the stop and think room and talk there? Now, again, I can only say something like that if I'm okay with all the options I'm putting on the table. If I present an option hoping the student doesn't pick it, and then they do, and then I back out, that student won't trust me as much, and that will make me less effective when I work with them. If done right, though, this can be a very effective strategy because we know that people are more likely to engage and be on board with stuff if they have a say. So for example, if a student is playing with something at their desk, I might give them the option of putting it in their pocket, their backpack, or on my desk. That situation could go much better than if I start right out insisting that they give me the toy.
Thank you, Rye. You just handled choice statements all by yourself.
Right?
Thank you. And last but not least, we're going to talk about offering a cool down or a calm down break. So this is a good reminder that sometimes the best option at any given moment is just for me to shut my mouth and give the student a minute or a few minutes to slow down those gears in their head that are moving so fast. So if I'm having a corrective chat with a student and they start to yell or scream or swear at me, I might say, hey, looks like you're at a 4. Why don't you take a few deep breaths? I'll give you a minute. And there's a bunch of things to tweak in that little example I gave. Like I used a 4, which was referencing the 5-point scale. You could just as easily say, looks like you're angry. You heard me suggest deep breaths. I could suggest square breathing. I could suggest positive self-talk. I could suggest pacing if that's an option. Or I could suggest nothing at all. I could say, I'll give you a minute, and that could be it. It really comes down to the student. If you work with them, you'll get to know what are the best things to suggest and say when you're suggesting they have a cool down break. Like if I know Ben does a good job with belly breaths when he's upset, but Jenny likes counting, those are the things that I would suggest to each of them respectively. In general, you just want to keep your words as short and tight as possible. I'm not trying to lecture the student or babble on. I'm just trying to give them an opportunity to use one of their calm down strategies. So with that, let's wrap it up and talk takeaways, guys. We are educators, so we're definitely going to be in situations where we've lost instructional control. And in those situations, the student might obviously be very agitated, like we can see very clearly they're in fight or flight mode. Or that might not be the case, but either way, these strategies are going to help us give us our best shot at getting the situation back on track. We talked about praise and empathy statements, that short little comment at the beginning of your interaction that helps get things off on a good tone. We talked about reality statements and coupling statements, which I would call kind of the bread and butter here because we're probably going to use those most often. We talked about choice statements, which are pretty self-explanatory, and then just simply offering a calm down break. We can't emphasize enough how important it is to stay in control of your own nonverbals, your body language, your voice tone, and your voice volume. It will definitely make or break your success. Picking the right words, quote unquote, is definitely not enough just on its own, because we've talked on the podcast before about how so much of our communication is nonverbal. And yeah, we want to hit that Goldilocks zone where we're being authoritative, not authoritarian, not permissive, authoritative, that balance. We're maintaining boundaries, so I'm not going to be permissive and try to have a conversation with the student while they're actively being disruptive or dangerous. These de-escalation strategies are hopefully, if I'm using them right, going to be short and sweet, and I'm just using them to help get that student back on track. And once we're back in instructional control and I've helped them to de-escalate, that would be our good opportunity to empathize, to process, to problem solve, all those good, important things that we need to do to support students. We hope you enjoyed learning about these verbal de-escalation strategies, and we hope they help you support students as much as they have for us.
Thanks for spending time with us today. Make sure to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell so that you're notified when new episodes are released each week. We'll see you when you come back for another slice of SEL.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.